Hey everybody, welcome back to the Financial Freedom Show. My name is Rob Berger. In today's episode, we're going to talk about how much cash you should have on hand once you retire. It's been an important question for me as I sort of move into semi-retirement. It also came up in the last video on the bucket strategy. A lot of folks said they're not going to really follow the bucket strategy for all of their investments, but they are going to carve out 2, 3, 4, sometimes as many as 5 years worth of expenses in cash. They just needed that to feel safe. And so today we're going to talk about whether that's really a good idea. So here's my plan. The first thing we're going to do is I'm going to walk through my approach to cash in retirement. It's very simple. I call it the budget dividend strategy. Then we're going to talk about the buffer strategy. Should we really keep 5 years in cash or some other number of years in cash, to protect against a stock market crash? I don't think we should, and in fact, the studies tell us we shouldn't. It's not really a great idea. And then finally, though, if that's not a good idea, are there some other things we can do to feel safe or safer, or at least, not lie awake at night in bed wondering whether or not we're going to actually be able to afford retirement? So that's what we're going to do. Let me begin with my sort of simple approach. In fact, I just implemented it. Again, I call it the budget dividend strategy, and you'll see why in a minute. But here's my simple approach. I'm going to take out from our investments 6 months worth of living expenses. Now keep in mind, you may have a variety of sources of income. You may get Social Security, you may have a pension, you may have an annuity, you may have a part-time job like I do. So what I'm talking about is the portion you have to take from your investments. You may get all these other sources of income, and if they cover 100% of what you need, that's terrific. But if you do need to use some of your investments to fund your living expenses, that's what I'm talking about. So I'm taking that portion of our budget, taking 6 months worth, pulling it out, and for me, I just put it in a checking account. I suppose you could put some of it in a high yield savings account, wouldn't be a bad idea. For right now, I'm just putting it all in a checking account, and then, we just go about our day. And the idea is, once we get to 3 months worth of expenses, I'm then going to top it back up to a full 6 months. And I'm going to do it primarily through dividends. Now, in our case, it'll all be from our taxable account. While I may look like I'm 59 and a half or older, I ain't. So I can't pull from our 401ks or IRAs. Yes, technically there are ways you could, but we're not. And I'm a couple of decades away from a required minimum distribution. So what we're going to do is fund this spending account first from dividends. And the thing I like about it is dividends from a mutual fund or an ETF typically are paid at the end of each quarter. So think March, June, September, December. And so I've lined it up with those dates. So for example, at the end of September, assuming we haven't blown our budget, we should be down to about 3 months worth of expenses. And we will get a dividend payment in September from our taxable accounts. I will take that dividend payment, which we do not reinvest automatically, and I'll simply move it over into our checking account. If I need a little bit more, I'll go ahead and sell what I need and still just rebalance once a year. But the thing I like about this approach is a couple things. One is it makes budgeting a little bit easier. I mean, I track our spending through both personal capital and tiller money. But with this approach, I can also just look at our checking account balance and know how we're doing, whether we're doing well or maybe spent more than we had expected to. So it does make budgeting a little easier. And then by coinciding it with the dividend payments, I can at least work on minimizing the tax liabilities from this strategy. Now, of course, you may be in a different situation. If you're old enough to be getting required minimum distributions, certainly when I reach that age, God willing, we'll use that as well, of course, because it'll already be taxable income. So exactly how you pull money from your investment portfolio will depend on your specific circumstances. But that's what we're doing, and so I just gave it the name budget dividend strategy. It gives us enough money so I don't worry about paying the utility bills or the grocery bill. I don't worry about bouncing a check, which I actually did a couple of weeks ago for the first time in decades. That was embarrassing. Don't have to worry about that. It gives me enough really in case of an emergency, that doesn't go below 3 months worth of expenses. So that's nice. And again, coinciding with dividends, it makes it easy to fill it back up. And we keep the vast majority of our capital working in our investment portfolio. We're not taking a ton out to stick in a checking account that makes no interest, or even an online savings account that makes, next to no interest. So that's our approach. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of folks wrote in response to the bucket strategy and said, Rob, appreciate what you're doing. I'm doing my own thing, which of course we all need to make our own decisions. I've got no problem with that. I had some say, I'm going to be 100% stocks and then keep 5 years in cash, or I'm going to be some asset allocation, 70-30 or whatever, but I'm still going to keep 3, 4, 5 years in cash to feel safe. Now, there is some initial appeal to that. Let me show you on the screen. What you're looking at is the return of effectively the equivalent of the S&P 500 index going all the way back to 1928. 1928, by the way, that's a great year. Look at that, almost 38%. Of course, we all know what happened after that. But as you look at this, you can see the absolute worst performance was the 4 years that followed it, beginning, of course, with the big crash in 1929, and it just got worse. Look at that year, 47%. Can you imagine you're in retirement? I mean, I don't know how I'd handle it. I guess I'd go get a job. Wait, they didn't have any jobs back then. I don't know what I'd do. In any event, this is really the idea, right? It's like, there's no guarantee that we couldn't have a worse stock market. Maybe around the corner, we'll experience 5 years of declines in a row. It's certainly possible. But the idea of the 5-year buffer is at least 99.9% of the time, it's going to give us enough of a shock absorber to get through a really bad stock market. And we can just spend down our cash. We'll leave our investments alone. And then once we get to, just using these years as a hypothetical, once we get to 1933 and our portfolio, at least the stock portfolio, jumps by almost 50%, then we can refill our 5-year bucket, and we'll be selling when stocks are up rather than when they're in the red. Now, I get that makes intuitive appeal. Here's the problem. Holding that much cash puts a real drag on your overall returns of your portfolio. It may work great if we're living in 1929, but over a 20, 30, 40-year retirement period, the reality is we're going to have good years, we're going to have bad years, we're going to have good decades, we're going to have bad decades. And to position a portfolio that assumes the absolute worst might help us in that 1 out of 100 time periods, but it's going to really hurt us in most of the others. And in fact, studies show this. And we can actually go back to the father of the 4% rule, our good friend Bill Bengen. Remember, he wrote the 1994 paper that sort of ushered in what we now know as the 4% rule. Well, he didn't stop there. He kept writing some other papers, and I'm going to show you one. And by the way, in the first comment below the video, I'm going to have a link to an article I published on my site, robberger.com, that links to all of the studies I'm going to mention in today's video, along with several that I'm not going to mention. So if you want to check those out, you can check out the link below. But let's take a look at his paper. Here it is. And there's Mr. Bengen. And this was published in 1997. So this would have been 3 years after the paper he published that brought us the 4% rule. As you can tell, a lot of charts. This paper actually answers a series of different questions, but one of them was whether you should hold some cash. Right here you can see the beginning of this section. Is cash trash? And his question is, including treasury bills in the asset mix. Now remember what a treasury bill is. It's a U.S. government bond that matures in under 12 months. So if it matures in less than a year, they call it a bill. If it matures in longer than a year, it's called a bond. So think treasury bills are basically the same thing as cash. And I want to show you a chart. At first, this may look just mind-numbing, but it's actually pretty straightforward. This bottom row right here is the allocation to stocks. So he assumed different allocations ranging from 50% stocks up to 75%. He picked that range because from his 1994 paper, he found that that's the range you need to have if you want to have the best likelihood of success if you start with withdrawing 4% in year 1 of retirement and then adjusting it for inflation. And what he's considering here, this is the initial withdrawal rate that you could have from 3.7 up to 4.2. This top line is basically the line from his 1994 paper. It assumes stocks are in an S&P 500 and bonds are in an intermediate term U.S. government bond fund. You can see we're right at about 4%. if you're at 50% stocks. But as you add stocks up to around the high 50s, you get closer to 4.1, and you more or less stay there all the way to 75% in stocks. So what's going on here? This bottom line says, what if we take however much we're going to have in bonds, and instead of putting it all in intermediate term bonds, which was the assumption in the original 4% rule paper, let's put, in this case, 50% of those bonds in treasury bills. Effectively, let's hold 50% of our bond portfolio in cash. Well, you can see if we're at 50% stocks, boy, this really drops the initial withdrawal rate down from almost 4% all the way down to under 3.8. And while it does a little better as you add stocks to your allocation, it never comes up to the original line. And the same is true right here if we convert the bond portfolio, 25% of it, to cash or treasury bills. Yeah, it bumps up, not insignificantly, bumps up the initial withdrawal rate from, say, 3.7 or 8 up to 3.8 or 3.9. But this line still falls behind. It's not significantly behind once you get into the 60% or more in stock allocation, but it's still behind. Now, the last line is this 10% line, and you'll notice it falls behind as well. But once you get to about 55% stocks, it's really, really close to the original line where all of the bonds were in intermediate term U.S. bonds. So you could, in theory, take your bond portfolio and put 10% of it maybe in cash and not see a significant decline in your initial withdrawal rate, assuming, according to this study, if your overall asset allocation is at least 55% stocks. I know I'm throwing a lot at you. I hope you followed all of that. But it's really enlightening. It shows us all the way back to 1997, we were looking at this. This is not a new issue. How much cash should we hold? And Bill Bengen was saying 10% maybe if it's part of your bond allocation, but no more than that. Now, it turns out that he's not alone. There have been a number of studies since then that have reached the same conclusion. And I want to show you one more. Let's go back to the computer. This was actually published in 2012, much more recent, by some professors in financial planning. And what they considered was buffers of 1, 2, 3, or 4 years of cash with asset allocations ranging from 100% stocks all the way back down to 100% bonds. And then they compared that to just your standard, take your money out as you need it, not unlike what Bill Bengen did in his 1994 paper. And this is a great article. I highly recommend it for those that want to do some follow-up. And don't be concerned about those formulas. Yeah, I pretty much skip them too. But what I want to show you is this is a good summary. So you can see at the top, we've got 1 year buffer, 2, 3, and 4. And he compares it to, this would be a buffer over here. This CHW is just an acronym he uses. It basically is no buffer. You just rebalance every year, take money out on a yearly basis as you need it. And he was looking at, survival rates and how do they do. And you can see 1 year buffer, almost regardless of your allocation and regardless of your initial withdrawal rate and regardless of how long you're going to retire, the time horizon, just doing your regular thing without a buffer outperforms. It's true as well with a 2 year buffer. It's true as well with a 3 year buffer. And it's also true with a 4 year buffer. So the studies are pretty clear. The buffers long-term don't help you. Now, before we get to some alternatives to the buffer, that's what I want to get to in a minute. There is one study that actually reached a different conclusion, and I feel obligated, full disclosure. I want to show you the one study that says, no, a buffer actually does improve your chances of, I guess your chances of dying before you run out of money. I guess that's kind of the goal of retirement. Anyway, here it is. And it's from our good friend, Harold Avinsky, or he was at least one of the co-authors. If you watch the bucket strategy video, you know that Mr. Avinsky is sort of the father of the bucket strategy. And this paper was written in 2013. And I'll just be quite blunt. I think it's a very poorly constructed study. And I'll explain why, but I do want to show you some of his tables. You can see RDCA stands for reverse dollar cost averaging. Again, that's just you rebalance every year, you take your money out. He assumed on a monthly basis. versus a 1-year basically cash flow reserve, 1-year buffer. And these are success rates. You know, how often will you not run out of money over different time periods? And you can see the buffer here has a success rate of 75% in this table. And if we just do a monthly distribution, your success rate goes down by 70%. Now, at this point, you're saying, well, Rob, wait a minute, which study should I believe? What's going on here? Here's why I think his study is not well constructed. There's actually a couple of reasons. First of all, as I mentioned, he only assumes a 1-year buffer. I think for most people that are scared, a 1-year buffer is not going to do it for them. But the second thing is he actually lets it go all the way down to 2 months. To me, I don't call that a buffer. I don't know. So it's kind of a buffer. I don't know. It's not really what I think most people think of as a cash buffer. That's the first problem. The second thing is he assumed a bunch of transaction costs. He assumed that every time you took money out, you paid $30 in transaction fees. And in the regular no buffer scenario, he had you taking money out monthly. So he added all of these fees into the monthly distributions and even said in the paper, in many cases, that was the difference between the no buffer and the 1 year to 2 months buffer. Well, I'm not sure what world he lives in, but in my world, I don't pay any fees when I sell my mutual funds, whether they're stock or bond funds. And I hope you don't either. I can take money out of my brokerage accounts, without any transaction costs. The final problem was he used Monte Carlo simulation, which in and of itself isn't a problem. Remember, Bill Bengen used historical data. Monte Carlo, you feed a bunch of assumptions into a computer and it generates hundreds or thousands of different possible scenarios and then calculates, in which scenarios would you have outlived your money? That would be bad. Or in which scenarios would your money have outlived you? That would have been good. And you get these percentages. The problem is you've got to make a bunch of assumptions, and he made some whoppers. First of all, he assumed stocks would only return 8.5%. Now, this was back in 2013. And I get that stocks are kind of richly valued, and we can question, what stocks are going to return over the next 5 or 10 years. I would have had the same question in 2013. But remember, retirement's a long time. I mean, if you retire at 65, you're probably planning for a retirement of 3 decades. And so an 8.5, or I think it was actually 8.75% stock return assumption certainly is a significant deviation from history. And I kind of question that. The other thing he assumed was that cash would return 3.5%. Boy, I wish that were true. Now, he did assume inflation would be 3%, which I think is probably reasonable, but that means cash is giving us a real after-inflation return of 50 basis points? I don't think so. So there are a lot of assumptions in here. Maybe you could have argued that they were reasonable in 2013. I don't know. They've certainly turned out to be wildly inaccurate, at least over the past 8 years. What tomorrow holds, I have no idea. But when you put all of these pieces together, it's no wonder that his study concludes that a 1-year cash buffer would outperform no buffer at all. I'm just not at all convinced. I'm very critical of that particular study. But again, I wanted to show it to you, and it is included in the article that I've linked to below this video. Now, having said all of that, if I'm not a fan of the buffer, what can we do, to hopefully sleep a little better at night if we're not going to have a huge cash buffer? Well, the first thing is, if you have to have a buffer, keep it as small as you can tolerate. I mean, there's a big difference between a 5-year buffer and a 3-year buffer, and a 3-year buffer and a 1-year buffer. I think the less we hold in cash generally, the better. That's the first thing you can do. The second thing you can do, and this is kind of borrowed from the bucket strategy, but I do this, I add up our bond portfolio, and then I just simply divide that by how much we have to take out of our investments every year. And it gives me the number of years we could survive on our bonds. Now, I don't do an asset allocation based on the bucket strategy. In my case, it's still 70-30 to 80-20. It kind of moves a little bit. It's still based on percentages, but you can get some comfort in knowing that, if stocks just tank, you've got enough in bonds that you could survive a very long time. I'm going to keep rebalancing every year, and so how many years worth of expenses are in my bond portfolio will fluctuate from year to year, but just knowing what it is, I don't know, it helps me. The third thing you can do, and this goes back to Bill Bengen's papers, you could hold 10% in cash. This would be part of your bond allocation. You could take your bond allocation and move 10% to cash. And there have been other studies since Bill Bengen's 1997 paper that have reached the same conclusion, that that really doesn't lower your safe withdrawal rate, not significantly. You should know, however, that it can reduce the amount of money you'll have when you die. Now, you may or may not care about that. Some of us do, kind of. I guess I care about, the kids and whatnot. Yeah, I think I do. In any event, you should know that. The studies conclude that even 10% in cash could likely reduce the amount of money you leave to your loved ones, to charity, however you're going to handle your estate. The final thing I'll mention, I used to call it the Doomsday Scenario. I used to come up with the worst possible things that could happen. The stock market gets cut in half. I lose my job. The value of my house gets cut in half. How long could I survive? In retirement, what I do is say, okay, this might be my budget, but if I really had to shrink it, what could we survive on? Hopefully, it's a lot less than 4%. I actually wrote an article about this very issue for Vanguard. It was published on their investor blog. I'll leave a link to that below this video as well. But if you could get by on 3% from my money, that's actually a really safe position to be in. You may be spending 4%, but if the stock market crashes and we go through 2, 3, 4, who knows, 5 years of a bear market, could you survive on less than your current budget? And if you're like me and you might have to make some sacrifices, but you could do it, well, that gives me a little comfort. So that's how I deal with not having 2, 3, 4, 5 years in cash. Hope this has been helpful to you. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below the video. I'll do my best to help you out any way I can. Remember, the article is linked in the first comment below this video, and that has all of the studies as well as several others. Hope you have a great day, and until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.